Yat A. Osio, hello, and a warm welcome to the sixth session of our new speaker series, A Sense of Place, the Human Connection to Earth, Water, and Sky. It's our 26th session, which we began in 2000. Um, this series is hosted and funded by the Indigenous Education Institute. Today's session is also supported by Oregon State University, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Superfund Research Center from Corvallis, Oregon. We are honored to have three panelists today, all of whom are professors at Oregon State University. My name is Nancy Maryboy, and I am from Tsetlagai-des-A, which is White Rocks, Utah, currently living in the San Juan Islands, Washington. My Diné clans, I am Diné, which is Navajo, Diné and Saligi, Navajo and Cherokee. My Cherokee name is Tsawayuga, and I am from the Cherokee Bird Clan. My Diné Navajo clans are Betwoni, the Deer Springs clan, and Tsenjikini, the Cliff Dweller clan, which has ancient relationships with the Santa Clara Pueblo. I'm the founding president and executive director of the Indigenous Education Institute, which has been in existence for 30 years. We are located in the beautiful San Juan Islands of Washington State and on the beautiful Navajo Nation, which you can see behind me. IEI, the Indigenous Education Institute, is an all-Indigenous institution with a mission of preserving, protecting, and applying traditional traditional Indigenous knowledge today. We also honor our many non-Indigenous allies from around the world, and we work with them in dynamic and collaborative relationships. I've also been an affiliate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Forestry at the University of Washington for about 10 years. Today, I would like to begin with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the Indigenous people of our Mother Earth, to honor our many participants from around the world. I also want to acknowledge that I currently reside on the ancestral lands of the saltwater salmon people of the Salish Sea, who have called this place home since time immemorial. I deeply honor the inherent and acquired treaty rights of these Indigenous peoples. The speakers and presentations in this series have been chosen to reflect an awareness of the foundations of traditional Indigenous knowing and living. We also honor and work with practitioners of Western science, bringing the two ways together in a collaborative process of integrity and respect. We use the concept collaboration with integrity, which is the title of one of our books. In this series, we are focusing on the human connection with our earth, water, and sky. A major focus for this speaker series is expanding awareness and understanding of cultural differences and similarities, and to support successful and diverse collaborative working relationships. Whether it be NASA HEAT, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, the National Science Foundation, or in education, health, astronomy, national resource management. Let's see what else. Museums, science centers, national parks, and tribal communities. I want to thank you personally for attending this webinar. The interest you have shown is heartwarming. We have many people registered today from all across the United States, British Columbia, Montreal, and other provinces in Canada. We have other participants from around the world, including South Africa, Denali Park, and Alaska. It's probably the furthest north. We also have participants from more than 40 different tribes who have registered. We also welcome many professors, teachers, classes, and we have quite a diverse audience. And as you will see, it's more diverse this time than most, and we're very excited about this presentation. So before we continue, I'd like to ask you to put any questions for the presenters into the chat box or the question and answer box. This will enable us to serve you better toward the end of this presentation when we will have time for questions and answers. We're honored to have Dr. Martin Storstedt from Oregon State University to serve as our question and answer moderator. And now it is my honor to present our speakers, Dr. Diana Rohlman, Dr. Joseph Jose Orosco, and Dr. Randall Milstein. Dr. Diana Rohlman is a faculty member at OSU in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology. Her research focuses on enhancing public understanding of environmental health issues. She teaches science, ethics, and Star Trek in the OSU Honors College, focusing on how to ethically conduct research with people. Dr. Rohlman will discuss how Star Trek has been used as a vehicle to discuss the intersection of culture and science. Dr. Orozco teaches classes in American philosophy and Latina, and Latin American thought with an emphasis on Mexican culture, history, and immigration to the U.S. He wrote the book Star Trek's Philosophy of Peace and Justice, a global anti-racist approach. Dr. Orozco teaches Star Trek in his Peace Studies class. He discusses the ways Star Trek has presented ideals for social progress and human rights over 60 years that continue to inspire viewers and students. Dr. Milstein teaches astronomy and energy alternatives in the OSU Physics Department. He is the astronomer in residence to the Oregon NASA Space Grant Consortium. He co-hosts the annual OSU Trek Wars celebration, which sounds very, very interesting. And a little aside, David Begay and me, we have been associated with the Space Grant Consortium in Utah and in Arizona, because Indigenous astronomy is one of our great passions. He speaks to how Star Trek's technology has been actualized into real-world uses. The results are many of the devices that we now take for granted, like cell phones, tablets, robotics, and medical imaging devices. So now I'm going to turn this over to Diana Rohlman. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Before I get started, I did want to acknowledge, since the three of us are from Oregon State University, we're in Corvallis, Oregon, and we're located in the traditional territory of the Marys River Band of the Kalapuya. So thank you for that introduction, Nancy. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering how the three of us all ended up together, because we do come from very different disciplines, and yet we all use Star Trek. And it was Star Trek that brought us together. I actually got to meet Randy and Joseph several years ago. I attended one of their Trek Wars conferences, and then I think I went up and sort of was like, please let me join this, and they agreed. So we all do use Star Trek in our classes, and what we're planning on doing for the next 30 minutes or so is just going through a couple of questions that we came up with and sort of treating this as a panel discussion, and then we're going to leave time for all of you listening to put your questions in, and then Martin can try and moderate some questions and we'll go through with that. But I wanted to start to let the three of us explain sort of how we settled on Star Trek and how we use it in our courses. And so we use it for very different purposes. And I wanted to let everyone sort of see the different contexts and how we've approached this. So as Nancy said, I teach a class called Science, Ethics, and Star Trek. And the true reason for teaching that, one, obviously, I'm a Trekkie, and I really wanted to bring Star Trek into my day job. But I do a lot of research with humans, and there is an ethical way to do that. And after a very long day training students on how to do ethical research with humans and seeing the missteps they were making during training, I went home and did what I usually do, which is turn on Star Trek. And the episode I watched was from Star Trek Voyager called The Scientific Method. And it demonstrates in great detail why ethical research is necessary. And I realize that so often when we have these conversations about what is ethical science, what is ethical research, those can be really difficult conversations for people to have because they bring their own lived experiences, their own biases, thought processes to those conversations. But if you drop them into Star Trek, you put them into this fictitious universe. And so they leave behind those thoughts and preconceived notions that they have. And instead, they're discussing, was the Vulcan approach to medicine more ethical than the Klingon approach to medicine? That's not a great example. Klingons don't really have medicine. But you get my point, right? That they could have those conversations. And so I built my class around that concept of using speculative fiction to pose these scientific, ethical conundrums, have students discuss them, and then we tie it to real life situations with the goal being we have to talk about the impacts of ethical and unethical research in order to avoid them in future. And so I have been teaching this class every term since 2017, I believe. And I love it because I learn just as much from the students as I get to go through it, which I think proves that people can engage with Star Trek while learning really difficult, thorny concepts going through. So that has been how I have approached using Star Trek. Randy, if you would like to talk about how you've used it.
Well, one of the classes that I teach also in the Honors College is the science of science fiction. And it's a very popular course that I have to teach every term except summer because so many people want to be in there. But one of the main things that I use is the prime directive, which is Starfleet General Order 1. And um, I wrote some notes here for myself, so excuse me if I look at them. But for me, the prime directive sets a legal and moral accountability to Starfleet for their interplanetary exploration as well as exploitation. And one of the biggest things that happens in this series is that there's conflicts because the captains or the officers involved will come up with a moral conundrum. It's clashing with that order. And that sets the stage for a lot of interesting choices that have to be made. And I tell the students that we have to think about that right now because NASA is sending out missions to moons, places like Jupiter. We've had these missions that are on Mars right now. We want to go to Venus. And we try to sterilize the equipment as much as possible before going. Because when we land there, we don't know, like on Mars especially, if there's life there. It might just be microscopic life, but it would be a pristine environment, and we don't want to contaminate that. And so we think almost like the prime directive, we can't interfere for fear of losing that, pristine environment. And we had to be very, very careful with that. And, Gene Roddenberry took that into account 60 years ago. And NASA has absorbed that kind of thinking, which is really interesting. And so that's really a question for them to think about. And also the fact that a lot of Star Trek deals with the other, how you're going to deal with encountering different species. And that's a really big thing. We don't even know how to handle that, people that are different than us on our own planet. And so bringing that up for the students to discuss uh, is brought on some really interesting, dynamics in a classroom. How do you deal with the other? Because science fiction is about how humans encounter change. And if you can't handle someone who doesn't look or think or act just like you end up with the world we're living in right now. So what's going to happen if it's a culture that may be more advanced than ours? And so, yeah, it brings up really interesting discussions and debates among the students. Joseph?
Yeah, Joseph.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Randy. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here to speak to you today. I recognize I'm sort of the odd person out. because I'm not a scientist. But I have been using Star Trek to teach my classes for about 10 years now in a couple of different kinds of ways. So I'm a lifelong Trekkie. I have been watching all the series for many, many years, almost all my life. And like Diana, I sort of wanted to figure out how do I bring my nerddom into usefulness in some sort of way. And I started, I think, about 10 years ago to realize that part of what I really wanted to focus on in terms of the way that I teach philosophy is the power of the imagination. And I started to really think that, critical faculties and reason are extremely important, but I was reading some of the work of our renowned scientist here at OSU, Linus Pauling, and he was talking about the importance of imagination to scientific discovery. He himself had a large collection of science fiction, wrote some science fiction that you can find in his papers here at OSU. And I started to think about the importance of imagination for critical thinking and for discovery. And so, there's a lot of different kinds of studies that show that speculative fiction, which includes not only science fiction, but things like horror, um, fantasy, all these kinds of otherworldly sort of types of literature have all of these kinds of effects of predisposing people to different ways of thinking, both morally and critically. And for a lot of the work that I do too is working with young people. I'm primarily a political philosopher, and the political mood of students for over the past 10 years has been of really abysmal negativity, nihilism, and loss of hope. And what I've always appreciated about Star Trek is this kind of hopeful approach to the future. And there's been several studies that have come out in the past year that exposure to science fiction, particularly, uh, uh, predisposes people to having a more hopeful disposition to the idea of the future. And as Randy and Diana have pointed out, it's not just any kind of future. It's a future that's very directed in terms of thinking about the possibilities of what humanity can do if it can come to certain kinds of realizations about its own potentials, and particularly about the potential for moral thinking and how to integrate things like technology in a useful way to make it instruments for bettering civilization, society, and the lives of humanity. And so, a lot of my work in my classes, both in philosophy, have been thinking about the moral dilemmas that Star Trek poses. As Randy was pointing out, I teach a lot of classes where we watch entire Star Trek episodes and then we dissect them using philosophical theories of analysis to sort of figure out, like, what's the moral dilemma here? And did the people in the story make the right decisions about how to solve these problems? I also look at some of the episodes to sort of get a sense about how to think about the problems that we have in the world today, like integrating technology into our lives. What sort of role should robotics play or artificial intelligence? Star Trek has a lot of different kinds of answers to this, but I think that ultimately they always come down to asking first, what are we as human beings and who do we want to be? And those are the primary kinds of questions that drive Star Trek to think about a whole set of moral issues. And I think that for many of my students, they're looking for ways in order to think through the future, given the kind of really the dark kinds of periods that we are experiencing, all the polycrises of political, social, economic, and climate crises. They want something that they can hope for. And I think that Star Trek in particular, uniquely amongst a lot of science fiction franchises, gives a really sort of rich answer. And for over 60 years has been consistent about that message that there's something about the future that we ought to look forward to because it's within us as human beings.
Thank you so much, both of you. So if I keep looking off to the side, that's because where my notes are, because I can't remember questions to save my life. But I wanted to delve a little bit more deeply into how we can use Star Trek to think about that intersection of culture and science, or really any intersection with culture. And so the broad question is that the show often depicts science as culturally situated rather than neutral. So thinking about Star Trek specifically, what does Star Trek get right about the influence of culture on scientific decision making? And we can broaden science. I would argue there's a lot in political philosophy that also intersects with science. So again, what does Star Trek sort of get right about the influence of culture on scientific decision making, and maybe where does it go wrong? I don't know, Randy, if you want to start,
Mm.
or you can defer to Joseph.
We're just trying to think through this question for a sec. Um, I know that Trek's philosophy about it, or Roddenberry's philosophy, was that if we kept advancing technically, scientifically, it would answer all of our problems. And you end up with this, as I wrote down, a self-fashioned vision of multiculturalism where racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual differences exist in a changing harmony. And that was all because of technology. And Joseph and I have had this conversation before, was what was a thing that really triggered that for Star Trek? And it was the replicator. If you could replicate anything you want in your food, that you no longer had to have a job in which you had to compete to get more all the time, to continue to consume more because you needed more money. So you're in this competition all the time. Once you had a replicator, you didn't need that. You could focus yourself on the betterment of yourself and then result of that bettering society for everyone. And I think that unfortunately, the idea that technology and science are going to solve all of our problems has not proven out. I don't know if any of you guys, when I was young, I would see these pictures of flying cars in this beautiful, clean cities with all these fancy buildings and everything. Yeah, I'm still waiting. The technology didn't solve all those problems. But Star Trek did provide kind of an outline of what you could do. Things like the medical bed, the medibed that they had, or the communicators, or the tricorder. I tell my students that this phone does everything a tricorder can do with the exception of analyze physical samples. And so when Steve Jobs, you know, wanted to know why Picard had a tablet and he did it, he invented one. And so the medical technology we have up at Good Samaritan Hospital, if you have an MRI machine, that looks like the medical beds. And every hospital bed now has a small computer screen with all your readouts on it. That's just what they had in Star Trek. So it inspired people to make changes and see what was possible technologically. And I think that was real important. And we are moving forward, but it hasn't solved all of our problems. And in Star Trek, the advancing technology freed them of these burdens. And it made this world for them where they're supposed to be free of this strife. It never really tells us how they got there, but it does a pretty good job with, using that as the explanation of how they live. So would that help anything there, Diana?
Yeah, Joseph, do you want to sort of chime in on, again, sort of that intersection between science and culture, or again, really any intersection between culture and how Star Trek, again, either addresses it well or maybe misses the mark, and what we can learn from when it misses the mark?
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the question. And Randy and I have had discussions about this a lot, and also some disagreements, I think, about the role of technology and in Star Trek and what it plays. Star Trek's interesting because it's coming out of this kind of post-war picture, a hopefulness about the promise of like the new frontier. That was big in the 1960s, like that there was a future for humanity to move into and explore new things in space. And technology as Randy was pointing out, there was this kind of view that it was going to alleviate all our problems and that it was unproblematic. And I think you start to see a shift in that kind of sense of the promise of technology and science, probably starting in about 1969 or 1970 with around these time periods with 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? The Stanley Kubrick film, where you have a story of that gets broadly cast about the AI computer that kills all of the human members of its space crew. And you start to get this kind of ominous sense that maybe technology is something that we ought to fear. And from that time period on, we have enormous amounts of stories that tell us about this dystopic future coming because of AI and robots taking over. There's all slews of movies in the past 30 or 40 years that tell the story that technology is something that we have to worry about. Um, Star Trek has rarely ever gone that way in terms of its storytelling. It sometimes has stories about AI and robotics gone awry. And in fact, it was one of the precursors giving a lot of prophetic warnings about AI and robotics. One of the great episodes from the original series, The Ultimate Computer from 1968, has almost all of the different kinds of worries that we can think about with AI and robotics in that one episode. And so I teach this to my students when we talk about the ethics of AI. I think that, in terms of technology, there's something really interesting about the way that Star Trek approaches the use of technology. And here's maybe where I differ from Randy in this, is that I think that the reason that the people in Star Trek are able to use technology well is because technology didn't save them, they saved themselves. If you understand the lore of Star Trek, 100 or so years before the beginning of the United Federation of Planets, there was World War III. There was a nuclear holocaust on Earth. We almost exterminated ourselves through all these internecine warfare. There was warfare because of genetic supermen. So there's a warning about the use of genetic technology, right? Which is the only prohibited technology in Star Trek, which is really interesting. Genetic manipulation, right? So that's a whole other sort of interesting story. Is that particular kind of technology was particularly feared in the Star Trek universe. But there's a war that almost decimates humanity, and we come out of it, and we become much better human beings as a result. And our relationship to technology at that point changes. And I think that the idea is that we learn something about ourselves, and there we can bring that to the use of our tools. So science and technology become tools for our exploration of ourselves, our moral sense, and our sense of who we are as people. I think the best example of this, and I'll give this real briefly, is in the episode from the original series called Arena. And this is a classic episode. This is the episode where Captain Kirk has to fight the Gorn lizard on the planet Cestus 3. And he has to chase this lizard creature because he believes that the lizards destroyed a human colony on this planet Cestus 3. And so he's going out there for revenge. And he's going through these questions about what justice means. And Spock is always asking him, like, what are you doing this for? Is this really about justice, or are you really doing this about revenge? So there's this whole sort of questioning about what's the value of going and trying to destroy these people. And Kirk is always like, we got to do it because we're the cops, and and they killed all these people, and we have to avenge them. That's what justice is all about. Well, they get to this planet, and these super beings put Kirk and the Gorn captain on the planet to a fight to the death, a trial by combat. And Kirk comes out in the end, finally, not because he's stronger, not because he's faster, and not because he builds a cannon. Right. So it's not because he has more scientific knowledge than the Gorn captain either. He builds this kind of makeshift cannon out of gunpowder and a bamboo rod. And he's able to finally defeat this much bigger lizard creature using the scientific knowledge about gunpowder and hard projectiles and all this. And so you might be tempted to think, oh, it was our scientific and technological know-how that allowed Captain Kirk to win this battle. But it's not that. At the end of the episode, this super creature, the Metron who brought them all out, says, you can kill the being, this lizard now that you beat up with your cannon. And Captain Kirk says, no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to kill this being now that I have subdued him. And the Metron character tells him, you've displayed the advanced trait of mercy. Right. That's what made Captain Kirk win, is he was able to think morally, using technology to be able to accomplish what he needed to do. But it was always those human values that come out in the end. And so I like that episode because it tells us a little bit about how we ought to think about our proper relationship to science and technology, is that if we don't have our moral values in the right way, if we're not centered in that the use of technology is not going to save us. And it might, in fact, lead us to utter destruction, like it did, right, in the Star Trek lore, which was World War III and the genetics wars and all that kind of stuff. So I think that that for me is always the important message about Star Trek is that unless we can get those moral values in place and understand the role of technology in dealing with our lives, technology is not going to save our problems.
Joseph, it's really interesting. I heard a quote yesterday, and the minute I heard it, it reminded me of what we're doing today, and I wrote it down. It's by a young woman named April Daniels, and she said, "The billionaires investing in space exploration right now don't want Star Trek. They want Dune." And that just sat with me really heavy. They don't want that nice world that Star Trek is showing us. They want the chaos and the moral dilemmas and failures of Dune.
Yeah, I think that there's something right to that, and I think this is something. Another reason why I like to talk about science fiction is because there are so many people in prominent places right now talking about science fiction. Pete Hegseth has admitted he likes Star Trek. Elon Musk talks about Star Trek, right? There's Space Force, right? And so there's what I call an elite capture of Star Trek and science fiction, of trying to sort of say, hey, we're doing what science fiction, all these science fiction stories have been telling us. We're capable of doing that. We're capable of bringing it to you. So you want to go to Mars and you want to have a better future? I can do that for you. But again, I'll say this, right? I think that what they miss is that without that centering of human values, uh, all their money and all their technological know-how is going to lead us to disasters and is going to replicate the same problems that we see over and over again here on Earth, sort of like what you have said here before.
Thank you both. I am always humbled in conversations with both of you because you think so big and broadly, and I'm very much a quantitative scientist, and I think about like, oh, there's this specific thing. So my answer is not going to be nearly as profound as theirs. But when I do think about the intersection of science and culture, the episode that comes to mind so much for me is the episode Half a Life. It's from Next Generation. It's Captain Picard. And the gist of it, I won't go into all of it, but for those of you that haven't seen the episode, there is a scientist named Timson from the Kaelon Society. He is trying to figure out how to save his planet from their sun, which is about to explode or implode. Clearly, I am not the astronomer. Apologies, Randy. But yes, that way. Um, and then he turns 60. And in Kaelon society, there is a ritual where once you turn 60, you go through the ritual. There is end of life, and they have this very strong cultural rationale for it. And in the episode, you have several characters that are, as best I can say, very rude and very disparaging of culture. And so if we take that more broadly and think about, are there times when Western science, and I'll just say Western science because that is what I do, when Western science has come in conflict with culture and how has that been handled? And what I find so fascinating is that episode so clearly demonstrates the harm that can be done when culture is not respected. And I think what that episode starts to do, and they miss the mark in my opinion, but they start to address it's not one or the other, that you can still do Western science while respecting culture, or you could expand Western science, or you could even say, no, we're not going to do Western science, we're going to do science, but from different perspectives. And I don't think that there's enough Western scientists that recognize sometimes doing good science is doing substantial harm to communities. And that can come across in many different ways. But so that is one of the episodes I actually teach in class when we talk about how to do research with other communities. I could give a whole list of examples. I don't think we have time for that, but I'd be happy to share them. So I think that is one of the ones I'm seeing in the chat, several others. I also saw someone mention the Q&A, the threat from the Borg Collective. And I think that's a really interesting one. There was the mention of this loss of self. What I have also seen, I mean, the whole statement of the Borg is it's now completely blank from my mind, but they say, resistance is futile. Your collective knowledge will be assimilated. The Borg assimilate. They strip individuality, they strip culture, and they literally force everyone into this Borg way of life. And I think that is also really quite terrifying for people to see that happen. And then there's actually been several really phenomenal episodes in Voyager that follow what happens to people that have been Borged. I'm still, that's not really a verb, but that's how I use it. And the damage that it has done to people through that. So yeah, when I think about Star Trek and science, I think it has done a good job of, one, like Randy, you and Joseph have talked about, like these big, broad, moral, philosophical, societal questions, but then it can also drill down to these specific disciplines and say, what are these ramifications that we need to assess? And that's why I liked this question. We often say science is neutral, and I push back on that. Science is not neutral. As scientists, we bring our biases, whether we know we have them or not. Science is not neutral. And the more we need to lean into that. And again, obviously, I'm bringing my own bias to this. I work with communities to develop research, and I have seen how the scientific question can be changed dramatically to better represent the research priorities of the people that we're working with. And I think that has improved the research we do, and Star Trek speaks to that. I don't know if there's any other thoughts that the two of you have on that.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because to go back to the Prime Directive, that I wrote this down yesterday, that the whole point of it is, you don't want to influence, a society that's building on its own rate and what it's doing, but it's established in case there's first contact. And they believe that advancement, at least Starfleet does, is the mark of readiness to join the community of civilized worlds. Well, who sets that standard other than them? Just because a society doesn't have a replicator doesn't mean, that they're not advanced, or that they don't choose to have warp drive and they don't want to explore space. Maybe their culture is one where they understand that they have to protect the world they're at because that's all they got. Something that we seem to not have realized yet here. And yeah, who sets that standard? What makes them technologically ready?
That's something I've always wondered about the Prime Directive. I mean, aside from the fact that we rarely see captains actually follow the Prime Directive, but and I have this in one of my lecture slides, but the Prime Directive says that Starfleet will not interfere with the normal and healthy development. Normal and healthy is very subjective.
No, very much.
And so it's even looking at what is culturally embedded in how they develop the Prime Directive, with this assumption that everyone else has an understanding, to your point, of like what is technologically advanced, what is normal, what is healthy, and then that understanding of, just because something may be appropriate in one culture, it might not be appropriate in another. That doesn't mean it's wrong. So there is that sense of cultural relativity that I think Star Trek does try, and often does miss the mark, but does try to address and bring up frequently.
I think one of the things that we discuss quite a bit in my students is that when you were talking about science and the cultural acceptance and people's thoughts and beliefs, is that it becomes very difficult sometimes for scientists, especially, I know it happens to me, is the willing suspension of disbelief. I can go in and watch Star Trek and suspend my disbelief, but when I get into a discussion with someone whose world is very narrow and they think that they have one answer to all questions, it becomes a very difficult conversation because you're not going to change that person's point of view. They can't suspend their disbelief. They just believe everything. And that becomes a conflict. And that can be culturally sometimes too very easy.
Yes. We are at 12:40, and I know we wanted to leave time for questions, and we actually have quite a few questions. So Martin, do you mind if I hand it over to you to sort of moderate and read out some questions?
Yes, and Chris, can you give me back my my video? I can't do it myself.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep up. I saw it.
Yeah.
David
So,
said, beginning of
so
every good episode is someone not following the Prime Directive.
okay. So there are lots of interesting questions. First of all, thank you. This was very enlightening. I'm glad you did this as a conversation rather than as a lecture, because I think that's much more engaging. That was wonderful. One of the questions that come, there's lots of interesting questions. Let me ask one that has to do with, and some of the answers are like, how do you use particular episodes and so on and so forth. But one big question is related to the idea of colonialism and colonizing and going out there and finding things and like making a link also to indigenous philosophies. And it brings up this broader question. How do you deal with this idea that there's a frontier? Why are we doing this in the first place to explore this question of how do you balance this apparent innate sense of wanting to go and explore and find new places with a prime directive, failing because, well, humans, and this general question of why do you do this in the first place? Is this something that comes up in your conversations with students? This broader tension that is embedded in the very question of exploration.
If I can jump in first and give a little bit of
Yes.
historical context as to like how Star Trek has been envisioned, and then I'll leave the deeper philosophical, harder parts to Randy and Joseph. But this has come up a lot related to that question. So in TNG, and Joseph and Randy, you might be familiar with this episode. It's called Till Journey's End. Star Trek directly goes into very basically, they've been told to go to a planet. The planet has been annexed by the Cardassians, not to be confused with Kardashian. I do sometimes screw that up, but by the Cardassians. And so Picard has to go to this planet and tell the people living there, sorry, you need to move to another planet. And it turns out that the colonists on this planet, they had gone there. They were Native Americans that had been displaced from Earth. And their first thought is, you're displacing us again. And the episode does delve into the very uncomfortable discussion around that. Now, I think they could have done a bit more. But what's interesting is after TNG, you get Deep Space Nine, and then you get Voyager. And in Voyager, you have the character of Chakotay. And years ago, I got interested in that. So I'm going to go all the way back to the original series. If people remember the character of Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols. And I'm terrible at telling stories. Sorry, I'm Italian. We get onto so many tangents. I promise this will all come back. The character of Uhura was one of the first Black actresses in a position of command on TV at the time. That was also the first interracial kiss on television, which I will give props to William Shatner. He and Nichelle Nichols deliberately screwed up that scene multiple times to ensure that the only scene that could be aired was them actually kissing, because several states in the South would refuse to air that scene. So they did force that to happen. Nichelle Nichols was actually planning on quitting Star Trek until one day Martin Luther King Jr. walked into her fitting room just as a fan. He was a Trekkie. And she said, thank you, I'm planning on quitting. He convinces her to stay. The reason I bring that up is Star Trek realized the impact the show was having on society. And they said, this has been such a huge impact. We'd like to try and recreate this. This is where it gets a little like they missed the mark. And they said, let's recreate this. And they created the character of Chakotay, who the character was Indigenous. And there's some pretty uncomfortable episodes, to be very honest. So I dug into like, how did they get this so wrong? The show actually did hire a consultant who said, I will consult to make sure that the character of Chakotay is correct, is accurate, etc. Well after the show had aired, come to find out it was actually a white man pretending to be Native American. So we've got pretendians going all the way back to that. So I think that is something just outside of the Star Trek universe, something to keep in mind as to when Star Trek has gotten it wrong, thinking about that aspect of colonialism. But Journey's End was one of those cases where they address it. I would say the other thing for me broadly that Star Trek gets wrong is they treat every planet as a completely homogenous culture. right? There is one leader that speaks for everyone on the planet, and they can encapsulate the belief system and the viewpoints and perspectives of everyone there. So I don't think Star Trek has been great for considering the sort of the feelings of colonialism. So I'd be really interested, Joseph and Randy, how you feel about it. But I have seen it as this very unilateral, like, oh, everyone on a planet thinks the same. There's one culture, which I recognize they do for the simplicity of an episode, but it is problematic. I'll leave you with
Yeah,
that.
I think that in some cases that goes counter to Roddenberry's original idea for this series. Because he had this vision I have here that Earth, the starship, is supposed to be a metaphor for Earth, and that the strength of the starship laid in its diversity and coming together, working in concert. And then Roddenberry actually made a statement that I read my students. It says that until humans learn to tolerate, until we can value the diversity here on Earth, we don't deserve to go out into outer space and encounter the infinite diversity out there. And the whole Vulcan idea of IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And then they do something like you just said, Diana. It's totally counter to the original philosophy of what he was trying to portray. Seems like, you know, kind of a disrespect and dishonoring his original ideas.
I mean, I think that part of the question about colonialism is that runs through the entire genre of science fiction altogether. And so I think you can't get away from this question at all. I mean, if you look at the science fiction of the time in the 50s and 60s, there's so much that embodies this kind of colonial outlook of the frontier and of colonizing, going out into space, taking over. I saw another question in there about the sort of use of the sort of military structure for space exploration. So much of science fiction at this time is just deeply imbued, and still, even to this day, I think you see these kinds of representations. Like one of my favorite series nowadays is For All Mankind on Apple TV, which is this alternative history about a space exploration and going out to Mars and creating the first colony there. And there was an episode where I saw someone saying, like, why are we doing this? Why are we on this ball of dirt? And the response is, we're human. We always want to look and to see what's beyond the next hill. And so I think that as part of the genre, at least in the West, we have this kind of trope of exploration. I'll say this in the benefit of Star Trek. I think that Roddenberry recognized this, but what's interesting is that Star Trek tries to be non-colonial in so many ways, right? The Prime Directive is this attempt, I think, to provide ethical guideposts on the idea of exploration that were unlike anything that had been thought of up to this point. How do we explore, but in a non-destructive, non-colonial way? What are the ethical guidelines to doing this kind of thing, giving into this impulse? And about the military structure, I've talked to various people about this, and someone told me once, the Star Trek military structure is a lot less like the Navy and much more like the Coast Guard. Right. And so, right, which is like, as many service people often say, is the lightest of the military services. Right. It has a military structure, but that's for the purposes of accomplishing missions. It's not deeply bound up into subordination and hierarchy. No, I'm not a military person and I've never served, so I don't really know if that's true. But I think that if you really look at the way in which Star Trek operates, yes, there's a captain and he or she gives orders. Right, but the quintessential Star Trek scene always in every series is the meeting in the briefing room. Right. You have this from the very beginning. There's this deep sense of collaboration, of people coming together, bringing their professional expertises to talk through a problem, work it out, try to figure out what the alternatives is. And yes, there is someone that has the ultimate decisions, but you rarely ever see a captain make a decision unilaterally without consultation of a whole bunch of different professionals. And usually, sometimes too, when a captain makes a unilateral distinction, it comes to bite them in in the butt in the end because someone tells them, well, you know what, I told you that that wasn't going to work. And so I think that Star Trek has this kind of really interesting relationship to this. It's sort of a subversive take on a lot of the tropes of science fiction at the time. It uses them, but it also tries to sort of warn us against the sort of colonial excesses of both a military dominant structure and also of the exploration theme. But I think that these are deep, important questions to ask. They still continue to sort of infect our science fiction stories today. And I think some of the really interesting places that you see really good explorations of this question are indigenous filmmakers, right, who do science fiction, who are asking, like, what does it mean to dwell in the stars? Meaning that maybe the our home is much broader than just planet Earth, but that doesn't mean that we have to go and exploit what we see out in space. That maybe there's a way of thinking about how we live in many different kinds of ways of understanding what home is about. And I like those kinds of stories, and I think a lot of indigenous filmmakers are trying to explore that precise kind of question.
I think one of the things Joseph and I have these wonderful conversations over lunch quite often about exploration and going to Mars and things like that. And it's this idea that manifest destiny is planting a flag someplace. And that's a real weak excuse. I'm sorry. But, Project Artemis is about that right now. Going to Mars would be about that too. There's no reason to go there. If you go there, you die. That's the bottom line, period. And so just to go there to jam a flag in the ground, say, America got there first, you know, uh, that kind of exploration, I don't think is very productive in the end.
That brings up a question, like a set of questions that are have been shared with us, and have to do with, so if this is what we do right now, Star Trek represents a different philosophy. How did how did the Earthlings on Star Trek come to this new philosophy? Were they influenced by the Vulcans? Did they develop a new consciousness? How are they dealing with good and evil? Well, we know they're dealing constantly with right and wrong, good and evil, and so on and so forth. But what can we say about what, and are you using that in some form? And is it maybe also influenced by some indigenous thought, which is the question of, are these still humans with all their flaws we function well out there in space? Or has something happened? Is this a different form philosophy that Star Trek carries out there to prevent our uh, urge, apparently, to subjugate, to conquer, to put the flag down? What is your sense of this? And I know we're now moving way far away from questions of technology, but really more about the fundamentals of thinking.
I mean, I think, Joseph, you brought up the ultimate computer. There's so many episodes that I've loved that really point out that humans, yes, while flawed, also have this incredible capacity to be so much better and to think about others, to integrate multiple perspectives. But they also talk about, especially in the ultimate computer, right? The computer makes some logical decisions, and they bring in Vulcan thinking about this, but the logic, if it's pure logic, sometimes it doesn't have that human factor.
Yes.
And that is one of the reasons I love Star Trek so much, is it sets up these scenarios. And I know we talked a little bit about genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, but it used these fantastic settings to create these dilemmas that maybe don't exist in our world right now, but could and or will, and then looks at how humans could respond and how could they respond in the best of ways, or looking and seeing like how they responded and it didn't work and how can we fix that. And that's why I believe it's such a good tool to talk about these different topics. Yeah, I think I'll stop there because I've been reading a lot of the responses, and it seems like a lot of people in the audience, that's something that resonates as well, because you can talk about so many different modern day issues that we're running into, and you can draw parallels and realize like Star Trek dealt with this 20, 30, 60 years ago and had the opportunity with the writers to sit down and give thought to what could be the consequences, what are things that we need to consider.
Mhm.
There's a beauty to that.
I think some of the interactions with Picard in the queue have a lot to do with that Picard's innate goodness in his moral code and his ethical code, and how Q has to deal with that. And then he starts to understand human beings a little better. And the same thing with Data. He's trying to learn. And Spock is kind of outside that too, but we take their, say, Data and Spock's comments about humanity and give them weight because they're kind of outsiders and they're looking at us. And I think that those can be very powerful, shaping how our humanness is.
I'll say just one real quick thing about this. I think the way that I tell my students now to view Star Trek is not to think of the people, not to think of the Star Trek personnel as us. I tell them the way to understand Star Trek is those are the best representations of humanity that have come through a lot of struggle and hardship, but they're not us. When the different Star Trek ships go and explore and they run across a different kind of race or come across a different kind of life form, that those aliens, those are us. That Star Trek is portraying the aliens as us, and the what Star Trek tries to teach us is how would our best natures react to these kinds of problems. It's trying to teach us how we should act if we were our best angels, right? And thinking about how to deal with this diversity in the universe, how to deal with ethical problems, but that the people who they encounter, those are the people like us. I think TNG, The Next Generation, had a great episode like this where they come across a sleeper ship that has people from the 20th century. And they revive them. And the people from the 20th century are like, I don't know how to exist in this world of the 24th century that you're in. Where's my money? Let me call my banker. I need to talk to my family. Like, what about my career? And the people of the Enterprise are saying, none of those things matter to us anymore. And I think that that's trying to tell us something is that the people on the Enterprise, they're not us, right? It's trying to tell us how we can be different and better than we actually are. And so many of the different kinds of episodes are like that. So when I tell my students, when you're watching Star Trek, these are not us, right? We're the aliens. And we're supposed to then understand the problems that we have and how we might solve them if we thought in terms of our better selves.
I have to admit, like I'm just asking questions, but I want to say that I always found most fascinating about Star Trek is this fundamental difference between Spock and Kirk, heart and head, and how neither one of them alone can function. Like they're only good because these two tensions come together. It's when they have that dance that leads to a different form of solution that neither one of them alone would have chosen. And sometimes, if anything, uh, sometimes one wins over the other, but it's like this tension between the two that I always found very fascinating. So, is there a new philosophy, a new consciousness? Maybe it's this idea that you need to bring the other thought in. That's what's different from you, and together you get to a better place. I mean, sorry for like interfering here a little bit, but I found that always to be the thing that even if when I was a kid, then I first saw it, the series in German, to be honest, which is quite different. Um, there's another question, and there's a recency effect a little bit, but I'm gonna preference that for a sec, which is they're going out there, right? And you explore. What about when they bring things back? Like, in what ways? Is there ever something that you bring? So there's this idea we're going out there to learn, but what do you do with that learning? What happens back home with what you learn, what you gained? Is there anything there that you have seen that is part of your teaching? This kind of return back. What do you do with that? What do you learn? How do you process it?
Someone in the chat mentioned one of my favorite episodes, The Inner Light, which is where Picard experiences an entire lifetime in another culture. So that was the episode that first came to mind when you asked that question,
Mhm.
Mark, because to me, that was one of the episodes where they really did talk about this impact of exploration and what you learn and how that can change your perspective on things moving forward. I don't have much more of an answer to it than that, but I would hope. I've been watching Starfleet Academy, which is my new favorite show. And what I love with that is all the different instructors. They're not human. They are these different aliens that are bringing these different perspectives. And the students are incredibly diverse and learning from all of these different perspectives. And I think it'd be interesting to see what the other panelists think, but I have kind of seen this particular show to be closer to Gene Roddenberry's original vision, which is learning from other cultures, other perspectives, putting everything, struggling with the right words, but just acknowledging there are so many different ways of learning, ways of knowing, and that there can be multiple truths held at the same time. And I guess maybe that is sort of the idea of Star Trek, is that as you're going out on exploration, how do you bring all that back? And you're not just sticking it in a museum. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because there's actually a really fascinating museum episode in Voyager. But they're bringing it back, but then actively learning from it and trying to ensure that people continue learning from it.
The only thing I would say about that is what's really interesting is, back on Earth, right? And this comes out a lot, especially in TNG and in my favorite series, Deep Space Nine, is that Earth is a paradise. In comparison to the rest of the universe, there's no more war, there's no more disease, there's no more hunger, there's no more poverty, partly because of technology, and everyone is living their best human lives because they live in this utopian future world. And what I like about the sort of depictions of Earth in Deep Space Nine is that a lot of it is when they do go back to Earth, they often go back to Captain Sisko, who's the sort of main captain figure in Deep Space Nine. They go back to his father's restaurant in New Orleans. And they show him dealing with customers and cooking Creole food and all this kind of stuff. And so you start to wonder, well, wait a minute. Everyone has replicators. They can make food in their own home. Like, why to do this? And it's this emphasis that on Earth, right, you do things for the joy and the mastery of your craft, for the potential that it gives you to learn how to do different kinds of things without the sort of crushing burden of, right, capitalism forcing you to do things for money. You can have a restaurant and people don't have to pay. People, there's no money, right, in the Federation. So these aren't paying customers. These are people that have come to enjoy well-crafted food, right, from a master chef. And it's a relationship of craftspeople to one another so that Earth has learned how to get along with one another and to share knowledge and to enjoy life with one another in various kinds of ways without all of the sort of structural necessities that we have in our world today. And that's a really interesting kind of picture about the future of humanity is why can't we live with much more abundance that already exists in the world today? What's going on that's keeping us from having a world in which people can enjoy their lives, be healthy, and not fear war? What's standing in the way of that? I think that that's really an important question that the Star Trek future poses for us today, is thinking about why are we living now in the way that we are, and what's standing in the way of being able to live in a much better kind of way.
Yeah, someone pointed this out to me about Voyager, which obviously, like, that is my favorite show. It's a female scientist captain. Uh, but they pointed out that in previous shows, war was more of an option because Starfleet was very powerful, because they had a lot of allies. So if it came to it, they could respond with force. Whereas in Voyager, they're abandoned in the Delta Quadrant. They have no allies. Their ship is beat up. Their crew is cobbled together. They have limited resources. Force is not an option. They have to work with others, form collaborations and partnerships, and they have to try to get out of things peacefully. And it brings up some really interesting episodes in that sense of, yes, they kind of do come from this quasi-military background, but they have so many skills in diplomacy and how far they can get with diplomacy. And there's a really good episode, I can't remember the title, but Voyager gets stuck, not in a black hole, but in some possibly made up space phenomenon. All of these ships are trapped there. None of them have the resources to get out. The only way to get out is to share resources with other people, and then all of you can get out. No one's willing to share resources because they're all trapped in, it's a scarcity mindset. And Janeway is the only one that is able to get through to a couple other ships and says, yes, we all have to trust each other, share, work together, and we get out. And they do.
I want to ask very just a nerdy social scientist that I am. Somebody gives me a softball here by asking about the research on Star Trek. And I want to start this by saying there's a CSI effect that some of you may have heard of. When CSI Crime Scene Investigation came out, it had a massive effect on people wanting to study forensic science, showing very clearly that a movie or a series can impact people quite considerably. Now the question is, are the three of you who've been teaching through Star Trek aware of any research being done on the impact of watching Star Trek on people's whatever? Are you aware of it? If I feel flat-footed here because I should know that, but let's see. If not, I'm gonna look it up later.
Well, as I mentioned early on, there is certainly some very famous engineers, Steve Jobs being one, who was totally inspired by watching Star Trek. I know that Dr. David Brin, the author and astrophysicist, was here as writer in residence at OSU for a while. And he, really came right out and just said, yeah, watching Star Trek as a kid, that inspired me to want to be a scientist and then go on to be a writer. I know I grew up in that same period and I'm a scientist now too. So those things do happen and really move us forward. And certainly medical personnel have been inspired by that, or we wouldn't have, like I mentioned, the MRIs and the readouts we have at every patient's bed now. Those are all right out of that. And it's interesting in looking into that for my class when I teach it, I tell them that what's interesting is every one of those items that we credit Star Trek for in our society, from flip phones to everything else, every one of those existed 3 to 4 years earlier in the cartoon Johnny Quest. But Johnny Quest didn't have the social redeeming aspect of live actors and dealing with cultural dilemmas of the 60s, and Star Trek gets the credit for them. But, they did exist before, but it was, scientists, engineers, Imagineers who took those cues from sci-fi and moved forward. And when you research Star Wars, not Star Wars, but science fiction, and you understand that science fiction usually predicts out between 10 to 50 years what's coming down the pike. And of course, that's what we ended up with here as well. Now we're seeing that with AI and robotics as well. And who knows how long before we'll have our own Mr. Datas. We're right in that year gap there, maybe a couple more decades, and we'll have an android or a cyborg in our house, so.
Just a shout out though too. I mean, some of the original Star Trek actors were approached by NASA, for instance, to be promoters for the space program. So Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on the original series, was brought on to be a spokesperson for NASA, and Mae Jemison, right, who was the first African American astronaut in the for the space shuttle program, said directly that she was influenced by the depictions of Nichelle Nichols in Star Trek to become a scientist and to want to be able to become an astronaut. And then she later actually was on Star Trek: The Next Generation after she had flown in the space shuttle. So I think that people have recognized the power of this particular series to inspire scientists and engineers in particular kinds of ways. My job has been trying to say why this is important for social scientists and for philosophers to think about the moral ideals, because I think that there's a rich sort of storyline going on there that really can hopefully can inspire us to think about how to make this future something that we can take aspects of to improve our own lives here.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll probably want to give it to Nancy to wrap it up. And the question I ask is an unfair one, potentially. Let's see. That's for all three of you, which is, which of the series do you like the best and why? And this can be because you personally like it or because it's best for teaching, or is there none? So whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll just go. I'm a Next Generation fan. SNG. I like Picard's more level-headed thinking, and his take on projecting authority is very level and respectful. And he's always thinking through the problem. Kirk was kind of reactionary for me. But I also liked Deep Space Nine. I thought Captain Sisko was a really powerful, powerful character. So that's where I would be. I'd be on Next Generation, even though I've seen them all. So,
Yeah, I think
Joseph, you got a favorite there, Diana?
I mentioned this. My favorite is Star Trek Voyager. I mean, they had some not great episodes, like the one where Janeway and Tom Paris turn into lizards. That was pretty bad. My side note on that is a journalist used the plot of that episode and used it in a scientific publishing sting. He actually got the plot of that episode published in 4 scientific journals to talk about predatory publishing. That episode aside, that is my favorite, largely again because it was the show that was on when I was growing up. But you got to see a strong female captain, really diverse crew, and just the connection to so many different scientific topics.
Now I'm really interested in what Joseph you're saying.
This is a franchise with, I was telling my students the other day, 800 hours of viewing possibility, 60 years of storytelling. So there's a lot that you can sort of tap into. And I watch almost all Star Trek as soon as it comes out. And I have been watching Starfleet Academy. I enjoy it a lot. I think there's a lot really going on there. I've enjoyed a lot of the sort of more recent new Trek Discovery, Lower Decks, Prodigy. I think Prodigy actually has some really amazing stories that are probably some of the best Star Trek I've seen in the past, say, 15 or so years. Much better, I think, actually, than Discovery is. And I think that Lower Decks is such a love poem, right? If you're a Trekkie, this series is just such a great show to sort of there's so many insiders and insider jokes and Easter eggs that if you're a Trekkie, you'll appreciate it all. But you can appreciate it without having that knowledge. But if you're deep in the lore, it's a great series. But overall, for me, in terms of the work that I do with Star Trek, in terms of thinking about sort of back and forth about social problems and issues, none beats DS9, I think, because so much of it is focused on questions about how do we build this multiracial, multicultural future, and dealing with questions like Captain Sisko does about the past of racial discrimination and subordination, but also just these questions about like what the history of the 21st century looks like. There's a great sort of two-part series episode called Past Tense 1 and 2 takes place in 2024, and the depiction of the world. This episode came out, I think, in 1993, 1994. It's a time travel one that depicts San Francisco in 2024. Woof, do they get our present right? And it's grim and not very fun. And so I think that DS9 is, for me, for those kinds of reasons, and thinking about how Star Trek is a reflection or tries to give us a mirror to think about where we are in the world, DS9 is unsurpassed.
Mhm. Wow, fantastic. I love the fact that you all three have a different one. I want to acknowledge that there's lots of questions and interesting comments, both in the still open question answer and in the chat. I think this is fantastic. People are very deeply engaged. Nancy, I'll hand it back to you to give us a wrap up. Thank you and for staging this here. This was a great webinar.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, good. It's a little bit shifted the technology in this particular episode, probably for some reason. I think this was a terrific session. I knew it was going to be different and wonderful, but I didn't realize at all how different and wonderful it would be, and also how it really fits into our series as the human perspective in earth, water, and sky. Now I'm determined to tackle some of this 800 hours of viewing. But really, this was terrific, and I thank you all so much. And one of the things I noticed that was almost nobody left from the very beginning. And I think that's because I think people self-selected they wanted to know about Star Trek, probably. But nobody, almost nobody dropped off till the very, very end. And usually there's some in the middle and some when the hour is supposed to be up, and then, but nobody. And the chats were fantastic. And I think uh, I wished I could have been on a little bit more and seen everybody's facial expressions. We got to see the three of the speakers, and that was wonderful. And then when Martin came on, it was wonderful. So the good news is this has all been recorded, and it will all be available in a couple of weeks as soon as Chris gets it on. It will be in our Indigenous Education Institute on our website, and I think Chris will post that for you here. What I'm wondering is if Chris, maybe you can answer this question. Is there any way, okay, is there any way we could have the chats recorded? Because there were so many great resources that were mentioned. So Chris, before I go any further, I'm going to turn that back to you.
Yes, the chats can be posted alongside of the video. And that'll all be posted at our website, indigenouseducation.org. I will throw the link in the chat again.
Great. And that's wonderful because I can't believe how many wonderful, I've just been taking notes, but this was so deep, this was so timely, this is just kind of what my heart needed to hear these days. And huge thanks to you, Diana, for putting this little bug in our minds that we could have a session like this. And I don't want to see this be the only one like this. This was just terrific. I think it was one of the best things that we've probably ever done. So basically, I want to thank Chris Tarrant for being our most wonderful IT person. And there's always things that come up. We always refer to them in the Navajo way of the coyote who comes in to disrupt just about everything, and how it's dealt with. And actually, Coyote would have been a great character in Star Wars because he brings chaos, but there's always a reason for the chaos. Let's see. I also want to thank Ashley Tarrant for her wonderful posters, and I just give you all huge thanks for attending and for sharing, for the panelists for sharing your comments, and Martin, and you coming back from Germany, you probably have jet lag, but you came on, and thank you. So I just thank all of you for being part of this. It was really special. It was terrific. And you guys are so articulate, and the subjects you brought up and the way you handled them, it should be a master class just watching this. So, okay, thanks a lot. Have a wonderful day, and be refreshed and inspired. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary, one thing, do you know that Star Wars has been translated into Navajo?
No,
Yeah.
well, I do know that because when it came up, I was still living on the reservation, and it was a big, exciting deal. But I wasn't a Trekkie at that point. I was
This is
just trying
Star Wars.
to get my doctorate, I guess. But anyway,
Star Wars.
yeah.
Interesting.
Star Wars, not Star Trek, but Star Wars.
Oh, Star Wars. That's right.
Yeah.
That's why. Okay, sorry, I missed. That's a huge difference. Yes.
Yeah.
Randy and
Well, I
Joseph,
wish they would do Star Trek because it would be much more understandable to Navajo people. That's really interesting. The other one is somebody asked me the other day. We have we do planetarium shows too. So we've done one on Navajo astronomy, but we also have done one called One Sky, One Universe. Let's see. Uh, Chris, do you remember what it's called? I can't even remember. My mind is full to this morning. Anyway, we did one with 6 stories of different perspectives of this One Sky, One Universe, I think it's called. It's came out of Montreal, and it won a lot of prizes. And we so they just got with me the other day and say, well, we're going to translate the whole thing into French. And who do you know down there that speaks French and Navajo? Well, duh, none. I do, but it's not the right kind of French for dealing, being a beautiful speaker. But anyway, I thought it was interesting. They're looking for someone that can speak French and translate all these astronomy words. And we've also just come out with a lexicon with Navajo. NASA Heat has been very supportive of our work in Navajo astronomy and indigenous cosmology. And so we've developed a lexicon of all these words that have to do with the sun, because we're in the heliophysics part of NASA. And thanks to David and his beautiful translations, we have it all translated, and it's going to be a poster. And if you're interested, just send us a chat, because it'll have pictures, and it will have the Navajo and the English. So it is a different way of looking at the world, and it is a different way using the languages all around the world. That's something that scientists can learn from, and you can learn back and forth. And one last thing, in Navajo language, there is no polar opposites. They're all in there together. It's a language of relationships, but there's no good versus bad. It's all on a continuum. So our civilization could learn a lot from that too. So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Live long and prosper.
Peace and long life.
Yes, Martin, I was going to practice that.
See y'all. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.